So race and ethnicity is one of the facets that people are discriminated against, and it's a source of comes from a source of inequity. It's a type of stratification. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. The big questions are: what's the difference between race and ethnicity? Is race real? What is racist and what is not? Do race and ethnicity matter anymore? And how are race and ethnicity changing in the 21st century? Well, the definition of race depends on your sociological orientation. Max Weber believed that race was a belief in shared descent or ethnicity. He believes that race was commonly inherited and inheritable traits derived from a common descent. Contemporary sociologists in the 21st century believe ethnicity is the belief in shared common descent based on perceived cultural similarities, so it's not based on physicality. And race is a belief in a common shared descent based on perceived innate physical similarities. So that's has evolved over the last 100 years. Which matters more, race or ethnicity? Well, race, historically in the United States, has always mattered. It's been a key to the historical nature of the United States. Racial differences are key in socioeconomic outcomes and are wider today than comparable in other ethnic group gaps. So when you look at differences between blacks and whites, or Hispanics and whites, or Hispanic and blacks, the differences in socioeconomic outcome are bigger than Italians and Irish and German, let's say. Being white rather than being black makes a big difference. In distinguishing racial and ethnic labels, overall taxonomies, which are groupings, natural groupings, depend on time and place. Ethnic and racial categories vary widely across countries. So even within a country of, let's say, predominantly Caucasian people, ethnic and racial differences can vary from one area of the country to the next. Race, on the other hand, is anchored in terms of color. Ethnicity is associated with local, national, and regional geography rather than continents. Recognized ethnic groups are often, but not always, descendants of immigrants, as in the United States. Race has been used as a tool of domination. European explorers promoted ideas of innate racial hierarchies. Racial differences used for conquest, exploitation, and enslavement. And racial categories are imposed on individuals or groups by other people. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is the idea of hierarchy is not used with ethnicity. Ethnic categories are self or group designated. Ethnic terms are free from regulation. Question 2. Even DNA and racial analysis starts with man-made rules. So there's some suspicion just in and of itself. Racial groups designation is a matter of socialization, and races are real but not biological. Question 3. What is racist and what isn't? Well, racism is based on prejudice, which is the negative beliefs or attitudes held about an entire group of people. Broadly applied, subjective, and stereotype filled. So in short, their belief systems or attitudes, which is distinct from discrimination. Discrimination includes any behavior that harms or disadvantages individuals on the basis of their group membership. So one is attitudes and beliefs, another is actual quantifiable behavior. And it maintains a social hierarchy by blocking advancement of subordinate groups, which is not only the case in North America, but around the world. Racial discrimination takes different forms. Sometimes it's using negative words or phrases in reference to a particular group, placing limits on opportunities based on racial group membership, or engaging in violent acts against an individual or member of a racial group. Sometimes the classification involves individual discrimination, and sometimes it contains institutional or structural discrimination. So individual could be your beliefs and behaviors toward, as an individual toward other people, whereas institutions like government or agencies can have structural discrimination as well. Does racism still exist in the United States? Well, obviously it does. Prejudice is an example where whites in particular may avoid openly discussing race or frequently use colorblind rhetoric. And discrimination, as in an example would be Pager and his colleagues finding that racial discrimination plays a significant role in employment to this very day in the United States. For every dollar that a white person earns, a black person may earn somewhere between 60 and 70 cents on a dollar. Question 4. Does race and ethnicity matter? Racial disparities in socioeconomic status make a big difference, and they're seen in differences in wealth. The racial gap in households, wealth central to current patterns of racial inequality. Wealth, remember, is the accumulation of things that you own and has a dollar value attached to it. Its accumulation of wealth depends on intergenerational transfers. So if you're in a group that's poor historically, you have less of a chance of actually accumulating wealth between generations. Black families have experienced multiple generations of exclusion from home ownership and other asset accumulation. Income, on the other hand, still has persistent gaps in family income between white and non-white households for the last 40 or 50 years. More blacks and Latinos families than white families are below the poverty line, as an example. And stable base of middle and working class minority families that earn incomes comparable to white families. Employment and unemployment affect racial groups differently too. The black-white unemployment gap has been a durable feature of racial inequality since the 1960s. Smaller proportions of African Americans also are able to move into the upper middle class occupations such as lawyer or doctor. And blacks also remain underrepresented in lower wage service sector, such as people that come to your home to do repair work. While racial disparities in education still exist, they are diminishing. African Americans and Latinos have experienced substantial educational gains over the last 30 years. And you can see on the chart, over time, the educational opportunities are growing not only for high school completion, but bachelor completion. Similar gains are made among whites as well. And Asian Americans have the highest educational rates in both high school completion and college or higher. Race and education inequality have also existed in residential pursuits. Despite this 1968 Civil Rights Act, African Americans continue to be the most residentially segregated group in the United States. It also includes health and health care coverage. Disparities exist in a variety of health care indicators. African Americans have the highest rate of infant mortality, homicides, HIV infections among any racial or ethnic group. And since we're currently in the coronavirus era, you can even see health and healthcare coverage disparities and illness among blacks as compared to whites in the United States. Criminal supervision and felony disenfranchisement have also affected blacks differently than whites. In 2010, black men were 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and about twice as likely as Hispanic men. And felony disenfranchisement means that the person has no voting or legal rights because of their felony status. 1 in 7 African Americans is denied the right to vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws, as indicated by the chart. Men in blue, women in purple, and you can see how significantly higher it is among blacks. How do we explain racial stratification? Well, sometimes there are biological explanations, sometimes there's cultural explanations, or structural, that is in the structural functional context, and sometimes and mostly it's based on historical discrimination as well. So, in conclusion, racial discrimination is alive and well in the United States. What to do about racial stratification? Well, there were some movements in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 were passed. Affirmative action was used in the late 1970s to help people of color get a leg up in terms of advanced education and jobs. And of course, even the affirmative action program is somewhat controversial. Question 5, how are race and ethnicity changing in the 21st century? Well, the face of America is changing a great deal since the nation's founding over 200 years ago, which means that people of color, the percentage of people of color is growing. Population changes, changing racial categories on the U.S. Census, which is out this year, and changing stratification. Why does racism occur? Well, psychologists believe that it can be an expression of personality disorders, or sometimes they overlook the context that shapes underlying racist beliefs and behaviors, where you grew up in and the people that influence you, whereas sociologists believe that many people are socialized into racist attitudes. Considering the type of situations where normative behavior encourages racist beliefs and behaviors. In the North, it may not be tolerated, whereas in the South, it may be.